Hello and welcome to another edition of Razorwire. Now, today I have two really good guests to sit down and discuss this whole thing about LLM hype within the cybersecurity and information security space. There's all kinds of stuff being pushed around about AI. So, what we've done is we've brought on a CISO and a data scientist to kind of tell us and educate us what it's all about. We're going to be talking about standard AI, malicious AI, generative AI, LLMs, what LLMs mean. You name it, we're going to be discussing it. Now, this is a slightly longer one than normal, so please bear with us and let's introduce our guests today. So today, in order to discuss the subject matter of large language models, what they are, what the hype is within cybersecurity space, but obviously specifically because there's a lot of different spaces where AI is being discussed at this moment, I have two fantastic guests. I have a new guest and a returning guest. So the new guest is Josh Neal. Josh, do you want to kind of just explain to the people out there who you are, what you do, what you're about, that kind of thing?
Sure. Yeah. So great to be on the podcast, Jim. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm a researcher and a statistician, and nowadays a product guy. And I've had a sort of a 25-year journey in security. I spent about 15 years at Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is a U.S. Department of Energy National Security Lab. I then moved to Ernst & Young, which was quite a change from government research, and spent 3.5 years leading a team of security analytics folks in service of their managed security services. And then I moved to Microsoft, where I led their EDR data science team. That's Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And then we incubated and released the XDR product. I don't know what they call it. They keep changing the names on these things. I think it's Microsoft Defender XDR is what the current name is. And then 2 years at Securonics as the chief data scientist. That takes us to August of 2023 when I decided to form my own product company called Alpha Level. And that's where we're at today.
Fantastic. Welcome. An absolute pleasure to have you here. And our returning guest that everybody knows and loves, Richard Cassidy. So, Richard, do you want to just remind people who you are? And
Absolutely. It's good to be back again. Although I'm a bit more nervous about this podcast, James, than I have previous ones because of how it came about. But we'll get there in a minute. Yeah, Richard Cassidy. I'm currently field CISO for EMEA at Rubrik. Josh and I crossed paths there at Securonics. I'm very honored to have met this man, and very honored that he's still talking to me after some of my inaccurate posts over the past couple of months. But you'll see in discussion why. So yeah, that's me. Great to be back, James.
Fantastic. Absolute pleasure to have you back. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, look, this is a discussion about an emerging technology. It's moving and changing on a daily basis very, very rapidly. So this is important that we have these kinds of debates, and I do realize that there's a lot of money in this kind of space. There's a lot of people who have sort of like high expectations. There's a lot of people who may or may not sort of have difference of opinions. So, let's discuss it. That's what we're here to do. So, Richard, do you want to tell us why we're here talking about LLM hype?
Yeah. So basically, long story as short as I can possibly make it, is this. So I attended or have been part of and speaking at a couple of events. There was one particular one in Holland, and it was a finance leaders event. And the CISO of one of the large banks in the Netherlands, of which there are many in the Netherlands, she presented, did generative AI work for the bank in cybersecurity practices? And she went through a 3-month project where she attempted to use AI to kind of enable SOC analysts to do various tasks and things, and then go through that data and see, did it make a material difference? Can generative AI used in the way that she used it. And there's a lot of data around how she did it. So, we probably won't go into that in this podcast. But essentially, she took data that the bank had. She decided that they would use LLMs to enable a lot of the data to be readily searchable and available in the context of a larger cybersecurity question or incident. And other generative AI tool sets available from Microsoft and various. And after 3 months, she discovered that actually generative AI didn't in any way enable the bank to be better at the job, because there were too many inaccuracies. There were too many questions that were raised from an initial question that raised more questions. And she found more often than not, analysts or those in the cyber defense team would have too much data to consume and understand. They'd lose point of the initial question they were trying to solve. And therefore, they've decided to go down the traditional route. So this got me thinking, generative AI and cybersecurity, and we know it's a big business. Let me be clear on this. I'm not saying that it doesn't work in cyber defense, cybersecurity. It does in particular ways. But I kind of made an error in my understanding, I believe, in that, and this is how we got to this podcast. So on the 6th of August, at approximately 10 a.m. GMT, I published something that I thought was very clever on LinkedIn around anomaly detection. I'm laughing now because I've seen the error of my ways, and Joshua will help me understand them in more detail. And it was, and in my defense, it was based off of an article that I'd read, because I don't just make statements, for the sake of statements. And there was a post on dzone.com. There's an article written by Harsh Daya and Gaurav Puri. And this was on July the 30th this year. And they had tested the capability to detect anomalies using development in LLMs. And they had summarized from this article that there were uses for it, that there were ways to implement anomaly detection using LLMs. And they went through a process of data collection, data cleaning, model training, then deployment for what they call real-time analysis. And that's the bit we're going to probably talk about in a little bit more detail here, and then how you build alert and action. So I read that, I kind of consumed it, and I created a post on LinkedIn that kind of said, look, that assumed then that anomaly detection and leveraging LLMs, may be the best tool for the job. And then I came up with some of the complexities around it. What came after that was the biggest flaming session I've ever experienced in a while. And it was quite nice. People like Josh are very respectful. Others were a little bit more brutal with me about my clear misunderstanding of this space. And then, so I sat there, tail between the legs, licking my wounds. And I removed the post. I probably shouldn't have that. I think that was a mistake, because I think it's good when there's posts that people disagree with. And Josh was one of the first people to comment on it, and he's very respectful. He said, "Look, I fundamentally have to disagree with this, Richard. There's just a lot of inaccuracies here," and he listed out a couple of things. So I thought, look, I'm happy to be wrong. I know what I know. I know what I don't know. I thought I understood this area a little bit more than I did, but maybe I don't. And so I said to Josh, look, I think this is a great subject. If I've misunderstood it in the context of how I've discussed it, then I'm pretty sure there are many others, and I don't mean that in an egotistical way, that have also misunderstood it. And why did we do a podcast to talk about where I was fundamentally incorrect and what Josh is seeing and some of the things around innovation that he thinks may get us to a point where we can use these tools very effectively, beyond sort of the Copilot stuff we're seeing from Microsoft and various other vendors, but to kind of do a little bit more analysis in cyber ops, cyber defense. So, and it was a long introduction, but that's how we got here, and that's really what the discussion's about. Is it possible to do anomaly detection the way that I kind of described it from cyber defense perspective using LLMs? If not, why not? Do we think there's a pathway to doing it? Is it fundamentally just a misnomer? That's really where we're at. And I kind of want the audience to take away a better understanding of how to position this in their minds in terms of practice and outcomes. So there we go. I'll pause there.
Okay, right. There we go. Josh, go for it.
Well, I when I saw Richard's post, I've always enjoyed collaboration with Richard and respected him. And so when I saw the post, I paused because I didn't want to publicly, beat him up. But the larger confusion around the application of large language models to security overwhelmed my caution in beating up my friend Richard. So I pulled the trigger, but only after some trepidation and how he would take it. To Richard's credit, here we are talking about it in more depth, and I think that shows a lot of character from Richard to sort of let's explore it a little bit more and try to get to the truth, because in the end, the thing that is at stake here is the protection of our enterprises and our customers, the protection of the industry at large from criminals and nation states. I think we're all on that mission, and the faster we get to the truth, the better we can protect folks. So
Totally agree. And at the end of the day, as both of you quite rightly said, we don't need to beat one another up if one another's wrong about something. This is how technology changes. This is how security changes. This is how understanding works. I come at it from a very layman term. I've been a CISO myself. I've been in charge of InfoSec. I've been involved in conversations around this kind of space, but I am in no way, shape, or form qualified to really make any big comments. But this is why we have you, Josh. So what is the truth? I mean, what are we looking at the moment? In the grand scheme of things, there's a lot of hype. Obviously, that's the title of this kind of thing. There's a lot of marketing people who are getting involved. There's a lot of sales people getting involved. There's a lot of new companies popping up all the time. We've got VC money flying off the shelves, flying out of bank accounts and directly into new startups that relate to AI. And if as we've debated plenty of times on this channel, you speak to pretty much anybody in the technological space in the InfoSec, and they will say that their product is powered by AI. And we all know it's probably not. It's just a bit of machine learning or some decent scripting. What is the actual truth? I mean, where are we at the moment?
oh my gosh, I've been wondering where to start this discussion because it's quite extensive. So I think the first thing to say is that the term AI is pretty confusing. I think especially the I in AI, the intelligence part, and that leads to a lot of confusion among folks. I want to kind of throw that term away, at least for purposes of this discussion, and be a little more specific. Broadly, we can separate sort of inferential methods or methods that algorithms that learn from the data, if you will. We can separate those, and you can call it machine learning. I'm okay with that. Statistics is another good term for a lot of these methods are statistical. And you can broadly separate those into two categories. One is what I'll call shallow learning, and the other I'll call deep learning. Deep learning, and forgive me, I'm going to have to go into a little bit of detail here. Deep learning was originally designed back in the 90s, early 2000s, neural networks to discover structure in unstructured data. Now, I need to talk about structured and unstructured data, and it's pretty simple. Structured data is data for which we know the fields or can determine the fields, and unstructured data is not that. Examples of unstructured data are images and text, video, because I can take a picture of anything, right? I can take a picture of a dog or a building or a rocket ship. We don't know what the individual pixels actually represent. The subject of the image is hidden from us. It's not defined in the data. Structured data, things like NetFlow or EDR logs or cloud logs, that's an IP address, that's a timestamp. That's a username. We know what the fields are, and we have the structure of the data. So there's your definitions of structured and unstructured. And deep learning was developed for unstructured data. And it's complicated how it works. There are layers that do different parts of the analysis to discover that structure. But in the end, the goal is to discover the structure in unstructured data. Oh, this is a picture of a cat and a dog and a rocket ship. Okay, now we understand it. Or this is a paragraph which is describing, your birthday, or some subject that you have to discover from inference as opposed to knowing it from the data. Okay, so large language models, generative AI is based on a deep learning infrastructure, deep learning approach, and is most applicable to unstructured subjects like text and images and things. In security, we have applications of that. Certainly in language, where we've seen the most sort of penetration of these methods, things like phishing emails are text. Okay, it's unstructured. We don't know what the structure is. And we can do things like discover the intention of the text. Is it coercive? Is it trying to get me to click on something? With PowerShell scripts, that's a language. It could be about anything. When I say about, it's a script that does something. We don't know what it is at first glance at the code, but we can use deep learning to sort of process that and understand it. And so I've seen very good applications of deep learning for malicious PowerShell detection, for example. Um, the well, before I get to that, so large language models, the other sort of important thing about large language models is that they're trained on language. That's the second L in LLM. And so, because of the corpus of data that is used to train these foundational models and these big models, Llama or ChatGPT or whatever, uh, the, they're good at natural language applications. So, you want your model to be the data you use to train the model to be representative of what you go and try to test the model on. And in the case of these foundational models, they were trained on natural language. And so two sort of guardrails that I'm defining now about good applications for large language models. The first is it should be unstructured data. The applications should be something where we don't know the structure. And I'll tell you a little bit about why in a second. The second is language, because that's what the input data was, that trained the model was about, was natural language. As soon as you get outside of those two guardrails, other methods can either be, well, mostly what I found is both more accurate and cheaper to run or to inference to build the models in the first place. And so those are the two costs when you use a deep learning model to discover structure, but you already have the structure. You're wasting two things. One is you're wasting money. Okay, building the model is extremely expensive. With data centers, Microsoft is buying data centers all over the place just to do the inference here. NVIDIA's stock is through the roof because of how expensive this is. But there's another cost, which is a little more subtle. There's this thing called the bias variance trade-off. I'm trying to sort of figure out a good way to express this, but you have a budget in the number of parameters in your model. And the more you use that budget of parameters to discover structure when you already have the structure, the less accurate the model is going to be. And so this is where we get into what people call hallucinations. I think this is a little bit of a misnomer that's sort of in line with the intelligence misnomer. But in the end, the model is not accurate. And part of the reason for that is that you're wasting your parameter budget in discovering structure when you already know that structure. And maybe I'll just pause now because I feel like I'm lecturing and sort of let reactions happen.
This is why Josh is incredible at what he does, because for those that even have a marginal understanding of this, the guardrails that he just described are the very reason why a lot of people, even very experienced people in the cybersecurity world, right, let alone other industries, misunderstand what on earth LLMs do and how and where they should be useful. And it's just I believe, at least in the conversations I'm having with C-suite, Josh, is there's this perception that LLMs are this answer to prayers where it can go and make decisions based upon vast structured and unstructured data sources and give you context you didn't previously think about. But that's not what it's doing. It's just predicting in the nature that it works, the next likely pattern that you're going to be looking for in your input. And it's not at all gathering data and being this hive mind and coming up with an answer that you didn't think of. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's the bit that a lot of people misunderstand. They believe it's some sort of HAL, right? To go back to Space Odyssey, and it isn't yet.
Yeah, and I think that's probably, so I tried to give a sort of technical definition for these guardrails, but I think you're onto the right way to explain how LLMs work or what they're doing. And at a fairly high level, and this is my statistical understanding, I'm a statistician, so this is my take on it, is that an LLM is building some understanding of the probability of word combinations in natural language. So if we look at all of human language, which is what these things are trained on, enormous piles of language, it's understanding the latent structure, the hidden structure of that data in order to find areas of high probability. And then if you ask it to generate from that, it goes and finds likely answers in giant piles of human text. So as you said, Richard, the next word prediction is a probabilistic thing. It's saying, well, in my corpus of data, most often when I see this word, the next word I see is this other word. And so from that, you can kind of construct sentences and paragraphs because you're kind of looking for the next likely thing to connect to this string of words in order to make a sentence or a paragraph or whatnot. The other bit of this is the prompt itself, what you're asking. And so the technical definition is that it's finding areas of high probability in a conditional probability space in which the condition is the prompt. And that was pretty technical, but what I really mean is that it's not just find the next likely word in just giant pile of text. It's also with the caveat that I've asked a question. My prompt influences the what the LLM is going to return in terms of those high probability sort of elements in the giant pile of text. And so there are some repercussions for this. The first is it's probabilistic. It's drawing from some giant sample of data, sort of randomly, according to what things are most likely. And that means it's not deterministic. If I ask it the same question twice, I might get a different answer. If I can confuse it. If I ask it questions that don't have a lot of data in the training data, that I'm asking it something that most humans don't talk about, okay, and it's not existing in the corpus of data that was trained, then it's gonna draw samples from that, which are sort of equally likely among a lot of different concepts, because there's just not very much data to support the question that you're asking. And so I've found that I can confuse ChatGPT with esoteric questions that are not really part of the large bulk of probability in natural language or how humans normally talk. For example, when I start to asking it about cybersecurity stuff, false negatives, false positives, I can get it to disagree with itself. And the reason it's disagreeing, so to speak, is because it's drawing from a very unlikely part of the probability distribution, and therefore doesn't have a lot of data. It doesn't have. So that's one repercussion is hallucinations happen more often when you're in unusual parts of natural language or human language. That's where it makes more mistakes, which is exactly where we're at in threat detection.
Mm.
In threat detection, there are common attacks, okay, that happen a lot. And the sequence of things that happen is very common. For those, there may be leverage because it's going to be common in the training data for the LLM, where it might be able to compile the right context to say, yeah, this is a bad guy. But in many cases, the combination of evidence that we're looking at to determine whether we have a threat or not, a breach, is unique. It's never been seen before in entire human history. They logged into this machine, they RDP'd to that server, they changed the start menu on that machine, and this combination of 15 pieces of evidence has never happened before, or it's very rare. And LLMs don't do well with very rare in the corpus of training data. That's not something they're skilled at.
And this is the bit that I'd love to focus in on a little bit more, because my post was around that particular scenario, right? It was about anomaly detection, real time. I said, how dare I, using large language models. And I mean, I had a couple of objections to this article by Dizzo. I agree that we've seen impressive capabilities in natural large language processing, right? But from a real-time anomaly perspective, there's some concerns. And here's what I kind of want to deconstruct, because I think for the listeners, this is where they may be thinking, oh, I thought I could use it there, but now Josh has explained it's probably not quite the right tool for the job. So the first was, around the whole concept of real time with regards to LLMs in the cybersecurity context. And look, we all know that LLMs are very complex when it comes to real time processing, right? Because there's just things that technically make it complex, and we can or can go into it or cannot. But so the real-time inference capabilities in LLMs, at least from my research, has improved significantly. But there are very specific applications, as I learned after I went into more detail on this. And this unknown nature, this predictive nature, to Josh's point of the very specific new things that are happening in a new way, are not where it's at its strongest. Yes, from that incident, you may be able to ask questions about what is occurring, and LLMs may be able to expand the context of what it thinks you're seeing. And yes, from a SOC perspective, guys, that's helpful. If I'm a level 1 analyst and I'm wet behind the ears and new to the job, and I'm trying to understand what the hell I'm seeing, what does it mean? This is where Gen AI is great, because I can say, what does that mean? Or what are the next likely things, right? Does that mean it's going to solve the problem? It absolutely isn't, because now you're just slowing down, as we found with this bank in Netherlands, you're slowing down the rate at which you get to the time to answer, because you're letting LLMs lead you down different paths, which may be valid, may not, but to Josh's point, some more often than not, they aren't. And I think it's this notion that we can just feed vast amounts of data into these models, have them learn constantly, and then they pick out, threats that we've never seen before or anomalous. And right, we may get some hit rates, Josh. We may see some positives, but I think it's a very small, less than 1% positive over the 99% of rubbish you're going to get. And I want to focus in on that part, because what in that statement was was right or not right, and where can we help on this podcast get the listeners to understand why that approach, that use of LLMs, is not where it is today, and why it is.
That's great, Richard, and I can't disagree. I think you're pretty much spot on, and I would summarize that as producing the evidence in the form of alerts or just extra context in the first place. That is pulling out of the giant pile of data. That may be a bad guy. That's probably not a good application of LLMs. Once you have a set of evidence and you're pretty sure there's an attack, because we worry a lot about false positives, and I want to talk about false positives some, but once we have a pretty good confidence that we've compiled the right evidence from the giant pile of data we're receiving every second of the day, summarizing it and maybe getting some additional context based on that, is something that LLMs seem to be pretty good at. It's like a search engine where it's like Google. I mean, it has access to most of human language. And so it's like you're drawing from a database which is trained on or has been populated by almost all of human language. And that's pretty powerful as a sort of service that you can use. Okay, so then going back to the threat detection itself, not the contextualization and incident response, but threat detection, finding these things in the first place. Yeah, false positives. You know, and Jim and I were talking before the podcast about, in the early days of, and we're old guys, or I am at least. I think Jim's a young guy, but I'm old.
I'm definitely not young, mate.
And so in the early days, we just had logs, right? Like, and then we would like pour through logs, and then every once in a while we'd see a pattern, and we'd start to write some code, and that's where detection sort of started to happen, and then the emergence of EDR, and then out of the box SIM threat detection and NDR and XDR, and all of these things have generated more and more alerts. And at some point, I think we exceeded, sort of the threshold of we don't have enough alerts to find the bad guy. We're worried about finding the bad guy in the first place, and so we need more detectors, and we need to cover more threats. And I think at some point, maybe in the last 5 years, we sort of hit a threshold where the most important problem now in threat detection isn't create another detector. It's we've got too many alerts. We've got way too much noise flowing into the SOC, and they can't find the threats because of all the alerts, because there are too many false positives. Large language models in threat detection, and I asked ChatGPT this. I said, is AI threat detection prone to creating more false positives? Answer yes or no. And ChatGPT said, yes, it is prone to causing more false positives. So I fear that the application of large language models to threat detection, not context, but threat detection, is going to increase a problem we already have by tenfold, because it's not an accurate way to find attacks in the first place. It's fun to ask. You're sort of using the technology against itself. It's fun to just ask ChatGPT, are you good at X? Should I use you for anomaly detection? And in fact, in preparation for this call, last night, I asked ChatGPT, should I use an LLM for anomaly detection? Answer yes or no, so I could just get a one-word answer. It said no. Then I asked it, well, I've played with ChatGPT enough to both convince me that it kind of knows it shouldn't be used for certain things, but I've also convinced myself I can confuse it. And I think here's another problem with using LLMs for threat detection is that now I'm writing prompts, and the prompts are influencing the decision. What I mean by that is you can basically get the LLM, especially for rare stuff where you're asking it about stuff that's not common in the language, you can convince it to agree with you. And in threat detection, I don't want to convince it to agree with me, because if I say, is this a bad guy? My prompt is this bad? Which is stupid and sort of oversimplified, but for purposes of explanation. If I ask it, is this bad? It's going to want to agree with me. It's going to want to say, yeah, that's bad, because the prompt is influential on the outcome. And most of the time, if I ask, is this bad? It's not, because most of the data is benign. We have very few real attacks in our giant corpus of benign data. And so by asking it an influential question, is this bad? I'm going to get more false positives at the end. And maybe that's making sense, sort of my train of thought there.
It is to me, but I mean, James, this is the quietest I've heard you on any podcast.
I'm taking it all in. Look, this is your roadshow, guys.
Yeah, but let me ask you a question then off the back of this. I mean, you're out there. You have been, still are. You're assessing a lot of businesses around their, alignment to specific regulations. You're doing security assessments. In your head, where have you thought LLMs, Gen AI was applicable? Based upon what you've heard in at least the last 30 minutes, did you have a misunderstanding of the benefits, the weaknesses, the strengths? Because I think that's important to understand, at least for the listeners, because I think they're probably on a similar place to you.
Good question. So where does it sit within my side of the fence? It's still way too early a technology, still way too early. And, the amount of data that you've got to feed into these things in order to get anything kind of useful out of them, as Josh was saying, the data lakes you've got to have, most organizations won't have anywhere close to access to. Let alone training it on finding. I think the technology is really, really promising in order to help and assist information security people do the job, the hard parts of the job. As Josh mentioned earlier on, and he gave me shivers and hives thinking about it. The getting hold of all the logs to try to find the one tiny sliver of issue where somebody's gone and done something they shouldn't have. 20 years ago was extensive. It would take you weeks in some cases, to find out what was going on. And this kind of technology is fantastic once it's ready to be able to do that. But I do wonder, how are we going to get to the point where these types of solutions are going to be able to do what we need them to do? Because if they need a lot of data, where's that data coming from? You're not going to have organizations wanting to share what they've got and what they're generating. They might allow it to be sanitized, but you know what organizations are like. They don't like sharing anything, and if they're not sharing large quantities of data, then how are we going to train these things to be able to look for the problems that we want them to look for? Or am I hitting the wrong level here?
Oh, well, so I can use a foundational model that's been trained by Meta, right? Llama is an open source model. It's been trained. I can use it, and then I can fine tune it on cybersecurity data and sort of increase the accuracy without relying on private data. So I think that right now, the problem you raise is not as big as you might think, because I can sort of import this. Now, I will sort of say that labeled data of attacks, it's just not available. Post breach, after they've already penetrated the perimeter, where we have AV, we have malware, and we can see it and we get labels of malware. But once they're past that, we don't have a lot of labels of this was an attack and that wasn't. And that's both because enterprises don't want to share. You're right; they don't want to talk about their breach. But also because the number of different combinations of things an attacker could do once they're inside a 500,000 seat enterprise is more than the atoms in the universe. It is the number of different things they could do is enormous, and therefore any labels that we might get that was an attack and that wasn't are not going to be representative of what the attacker could do in the future. And so there is just a naturally, whether we're talking about LLMs or shallow models or rules, there is a huge lack of labeled data in cybersecurity, and that's just something we have to face. That's where anomaly detection comes up, because you don't need labels to do anomaly detection. The way anomaly detection works is it models the normal behavior and then identifies deviation from that normal. That means you don't need to know what was bad or good. You just model the data that you have in front of you. Most of the data you're modeling is not bad, it's benign. Almost all of the data is benign, and therefore you get a good representation of what should be happening. And then deviation, if you can detect change from that expected behavior, you might have a bad guy. The problem, so that's good. Now you can find attacks without labels. That's great. The problem is almost all rare events, which is what anomaly detection finds, are benign. It's some guy who got up in the middle of the night and logged into his machine, and it was really rare, but it's not an attack. He just logged in from his home computer. And that's the problem of anomaly detection. Of which LLMs are going to be even worse than time series models, which can reflect the normal data very well and find the deviations extremely accurately. Time series modeling is 100 years of effort in finding an anomaly detection, but even it suffers from too many false positives. LLMs, which are not as sophisticated in this particular application, are even worse at that. So I'm trying to kind of take your comment and make it into something that I think is really appropriate, which is the lack of labels means anomaly detection. LLMs are not the right thing for anomaly detection, in my opinion.
If we go into kind of, LLMs versus traditional anomaly detection methods, right? LLMs offer unique advantages in context. We agree on that. But there are other capabilities, statistical and rule-based methods that have always been and will be, for at least the foreseeable future, in my mind, very effective at detecting those scenarios that you should care about the most. And it comes back to a fundamental problem. People that are leading these parts of the organizations probably don't understand the key critical mission critical application services. They haven't done the analysis, which is what I call threat informed detection response, to say, well, these are my apps. This is how they're built. These are the components. This is where I operate. And based upon the MITRE framework, and it's one of many, here's the most likely vectors I'm going to see myself exposed to in the threat landscape. So then you apply the right technology stack to that. And yes, LLMs will be answers to some of those problems. But what we're doing today, to Josh's point, and the capabilities that Microsoft, CrowdStrike, Mandiant, and some of the others have, are not relying on the tools that we're talking about as heavily as you think they are. They're still using traditional methods because they're highly effective and should be highly accurate if tuned properly. So I'm going to pause there because that's something I wanted the less sort of technically minded around the LLM subject to take away listening on this. But I'd like Josh to say if he agrees or disagrees, if he has a different view on it.
I agree wholeheartedly. My experience, and I've been mostly a threat detection guy. That's mostly what I've done for 25 years almost, is it's surgical. You're doing surgery. You're finding a little tiny bit of signal in some very specific thing because of a lot of domain expertise, a lot of understanding of where the threats could be, and pulling that tiny little piece of evidence out of an enormous pile, unbelievable pile of benign data. It's hard and full of noise and very easy to get wrong and very easy to either miss the attack or flood the SOC with false positives. Um, and so, just, like my emotions get, my heart gets sort of involved here in passion in saying, don't underestimate this. The challenge of threat detection, it's extremely hard, takes a lot of skill. Um, brute force methods of trying to find it, which is what an LLM kind of is. It's this brute. Well, we don't know where the attack is. Let's throw a giant piece of machinery at it. It's fundamentally against my experience. This is much harder than that. You need surgical methods. You need smart people, skilled people with domain expertise to really do well here.
Yeah, and Josh, to your point, I mean, we've both been in this industry long enough, and um, I work for an EDR vendor, and I went through kind of how do we get from the point of an event happening on an endpoint to making a decision as to what the likely outcomes are. And it was an in-memory graph database functionality. It was just essentially we start here, and we've got all of these potentials that we know about because you have to configure the platform with potentialities, right? The probabilities. And yeah, I think there was several million or millions of different variations it would ask questions of the event for, and then spit out the other end of the graph what the likelihood was. And that's essentially where I see businesses, need to take a little bit more of a traditional approach. It's know what those likely scenarios are that will essentially shut operations, turn the lights off, and make sure you're asking all the questions you have at your fingertips to identify where they're likely to happen and when they're likely to happen. LLM should only be there, and not just based upon my previous learning, Josh, thanks to your response to my post, but also what I heard from the Netherlands CISO in a bank, is if used incorrectly, it can cause a lot more delays in getting to the point of outcome. But actually, as a buddy sitting by your side technically to help guide you on knowledge gaps that you may have, essentially a very smart Google, because it's more contextual in the outcome, absolutely that's where it helps at the moment. And I think that's where it should be applied in cyber defense SOC operations today.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Although I have a fear, it's not really realized yet, but the fear I have is when you're new, let's say a new analyst, just getting into cybersecurity, tier one, just learning the ropes, learning all the technology and things. This is when LLMs or assistants are most valuable. Very experienced people already have established ways of doing this. They know the answers. They don't benefit as much. And what I've found in various ways is that when you don't know the answer, there's a period of frustration and challenge and critical thinking that you go through in order to find an answer. And in very complex settings, that can be several days. I remember taking showers and not knowing, and then thinking about it in the sink, going for a walk, and all of this sort of struggle to learn the critical thinking that's required in order to come to a conclusion. And my concern with AI assistants or co-pilots is, with quick and easy answers, the junior analysts aren't learning the critical thinking required to become senior analysts. And therefore, we're losing our bench. And we're going to end up with unskilled senior analysts that don't know, when the LLM doesn't know what to do, neither does the human. So that's my vague concern. I don't know if that's going to happen or not.
I totally agree. And I think it's been evident in a number of different technologies we've gotten used to over the years. We become reliant on it. Once we become reliant on it, I mean, you try and take away a 20-year-old's phone at the moment. Holy hell, geez, you would have thought you'd killed their dog. And you're right, when this technology does kind of come down and start working as co-pilots, providing you with advisories, there will become generations of people who become totally reliant on it. Whereas us older, dare I say it, wiser folk, apart from myself, because I know nothing about this particular subject matter, which I've already shown throughout this, this is why I've stayed relatively silent. The thought of having Copilot to be able to sift through all the data and all the crap, tell me really what's going on, or sift info, would be immeasurably beneficial and cut my workload down quite a bit, especially when I'm doing audits, I would like to point out. I'm a QSA myself, and I think, I've got customers who say, I say to them, right, I need a sample of your logs. How many logs have you got? Oh, I've got about 4 billion in the last 12 months. Right, okay, so even a 0.1% sample of that is going to be rather extensive. So yeah, the thought of being able to utilize this technology to be able to assist me in making my decision making, not replace me, because I don't think anyone's at the moment going to allow that, fills me with glee. But I can see your point. Young analysts coming in, they're not going to have the same experience that we'll have with it.
For rote tasks that are data intensive and take a lot of manual labor, but are sort of repetitive and sort of fairly simple, don't require creativity, I think LLMs are going to change the game, and they're very exciting. Threat detection and escalation of alerts into incidents and breach response is not a repetitive thing. It's very creative and very challenging.
We're not out of our jobs yet. Carry on, Richard.
No, and absolutely, we're not out of jobs yet. And one point I wanted to touch on, James, because you made a broad statement, which I think is a statement that many will resonate with, in that they look to Gen AI's LLMs, let's be specific here, as the answer to the contextual prayers that they have. But Josh called it out very early, right? Large language models don't verify themselves, right? And so at least they don't verify their accuracy in the way that humans would, right? And I think organizations, when they buy off the shelf, commercial tool sets for Gen AI, just need to be very careful. I think the clever way to implement this is to have your own processes around training evaluation, post-training evaluation, human feedback and reinforcement learning, and then hallucination detection, which is a very active area of research, by the way. We're still not there yet in terms of accuracy. And I'll let Josh correct me on that again. But to your point on, a critical thinking mindset, this is the big risk here. I think in a lot of industries with LLMs is it kind of can remove that for the uninitiated or the newly initiated, to the point where, at Rubrik, for example, we create lab environments now for SEs during the interview process, and we place Easter eggs in the scenarios to bring out the critical thinker, to see can they look at a problem objectively, can they think about all of the inputs and come up with various other differential ideas, because that's what security needs. It needs those critical thinkers, to Josh's point, and LLMs don't verify themselves. So remember, when you look at that data, trust but verify.
Yeah, training is going to have to become much more important, and we're going to have to focus on, a program for, teaching junior analysts critical thinking that has to be much more deliberate than it is today. It's organic now. You learn from the seniors. You go ask questions. You learn over time. I think that has to be more deliberate with LLMs coming into play. We have to make sure, and we have to measure their progress It's kind of like going to school, homework, tests, that kind of thing.
Right, well, there we go. I mean, that was pretty intensive, guys. So for all of you out there sitting there rocked back in your seats thinking, what the hell is going on here? It's definitely an interesting subject. There's definitely a lot of nuances from it. There's a lot of sort of data science nuances. There's a lot of questions about how we're going to operate this kind of technology going forward, the critical thinking item. I think there's a lot more to this whole kind of subject matter than I think a lot of people are thinking in their organization. They just see it as, oh, it's got AI in it, so it's going to help me out. It's going to do all this stuff, but it's not necessarily going to be like that. I'm interested to see how this one progresses, and I think we're probably going to wind up having several more conversations about this. And depending upon how the messages go when we release this video, we'll see whether or not we need to come back again. Maybe we could bring on one of the other guys as well, and have a real debate, like a proper discussion over this kind of stuff. I don't know. It's important, and it's important we have these discussions now, because who knows what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah. Look, I think what has been important in this conversation, because you're right, there's one of hundreds we could and should have, was I hope what people have taken away and will take away from this is, where are LLMs effective? What are the risks and the weaknesses and the strengths today? The guardrails that Josh talked about early doors. Now, with that knowledge and understanding, the whole training and evaluation side, verifying and understanding that fine-tuning is a very good thing, although very costly. I hope we're still way on this hype cycle, that we haven't even got anywhere near the peak of it yet. What I hope people have taken away from this, James, is that they've got to take a very different, more detailed-oriented approach, and please just jump on bandwagons. And yes, you may adopt vendor tools like Microsoft, CrowdStrike, etc., whoever they are. But again, I still think there's a level of, okay, but how does it work for me, and what of my data is being inferred here, and how, so that you know that the context of the output is more relevant, and you're not getting hallucinated data or data that just isn't relevant to the question you're asking. So I'll pause there. That's my kind of takeaway.
Yeah, and thanks. I'm really glad for this opportunity. I want to be involved in this discussion broadly. I want the industry to move efficiently towards protecting customers, and we have to have this conversation to do that. I think we should celebrate the fact that we're talking about a new technology and a new breakthrough, and it is a breakthrough. It's going to do things. It's valuable. This is not high. There's not just hype here. So we're lucky in some way to be able to have this, to be on the front end of this sort of technology revolution, and it's exciting to see where it goes. I think, going back to that critical thinking thing, buyers, operators, vendors should be critical thinkers and very careful about understanding this technology and where it's appropriate and where it's not. To Richard's point, don't just throw AI at things. Get informed, ask questions, try things out, and be skeptical, as we should be used to in security. We should be very skeptical, and so that's sort of my message to the world is be cautious here. Try, collect evidence, test things, do critical thinking.
I think one of the things I'm less worried about people in security when it comes to this kind of technology and adopting this technology. I'm more worried about the other people around the business who drink the hype and drink the Kool-Aid and start implementing it, and then turning around to us and saying, well, we've implemented it now. So, and not even in the security space, in sort of like the consuming of data, the advisory, it's going to be used in sales, it's going to be used in marketing, it's going to be used all over the place. And then us poor sods are going to be sat there going, Christ, how am I going to do this? How do I deal with this? Anyway, it's right well over the amount of time that we normally do for these kinds of things. So, thank you ever so much, Josh, for coming on and having a chat with us. And Richard, it's always an absolute pleasure to have you on. I'm going to go away and have a pint, I think, because I need to consider what's been said, and talking to the producer about cutting out some of the more idiot things that I've probably said in this. So thank you guys ever so much for coming and having a chat with us. Maybe we'll return to this. We'll invite you guys all back. And to all of you out there watching, thank you ever so much for coming and being a part of the podcast by kind of watching. Please like and subscribe. We're rapidly gaining subscribers, which is absolutely fantastic. I do want to hit sort of like that 10,000 sort of subscriber count, and hopefully beyond as well, because the more conversations we have on this kind of subject matter and other subject matters within InfoSec, the better it's going to be all round until the AI overlords come and take over. I, for one, welcome them. Just to put it out there. Okay, thanks a lot, guys, and we'll be speaking to you all again soon.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
And thank you for listening or even watching the latest edition of Razorwire. It's always good to get feedback. Please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to us via LinkedIn or through our website, www.razorthorn.com. If you feel that there's something that we should cover maybe a little bit more in depth, a new topic, or something of interest to you or the community at large, we'll even do interviews. If you've got any recommendations or you want us to interview people, we'll reach out to those individuals and see if we can get them on camera, so we can ask them the important questions about InfoSec. So it'd be great to see what your feedback is. In addition, I do have a book recently come out, the Cyber Sentinels Handbook, a primer for information security professionals. Now, this book is very much geared up towards professionals at all levels of their career, be they starters, be they newcomers, be they people who've been in it for a little while and maybe looking for a little bit more direction, albeit the older ones looking to maybe reground themselves in some of the more important aspects of the trade that maybe they've forgotten over time. I've had lots of good feedback from a lot of different readers of a lot of different levels, so please feel free to get yourselves a copy. We've got the e-copy, we've also got the paperback copy, and if you don't want to spend any money, you can go on Kindle Unlimited and read the book for free there as well. So thank you ever so much again. Look after yourselves, and we'll be seeing you again soon.